So, my last main Battle Cats video was about Archer Cat and how Archer Cat was perceived to be this bad unit, but over the years starts to get more and more usages. Despite his flaws, he still ends up finding more reasons to be used. It's kind of like a nice, sweet story, you know, the good old underdog story of someone who used to be bad, turns out to be pretty good over the years, that kind of thing. So this time around, I want to talk about yet another unit. In fact, this unit in the cat guide is right next to Archer Cat, and this unit is Swordsman Cat. So, let's talk about Swordsman Cat and his true form, Elemental Duelist. Now, I think a lot of people would understand why I chose Archer Cat as my previous topic. Like I've mentioned, it's kind of like an underdog story, you know, it's a quote-unquote underrated unit who's not amazing but also still kind of good. It's kind of like a nice story of someone who was once irrelevant finding reasons to be used. But Swordsman's story is, well, let's just say it's a little bit different. What do I mean by that? Well, first, let's talk about Swordsman Cat and his stats. Swordsman Cat is a low-range anti-red melee unit. Its ability is that it has massive damage against reds, and therefore its effectiveness against red enemies is actually pretty good. In the early days, he's one of the highest damaging anti-red unit, especially for his cost. His true form, Elemental Duelist, gives overall better stat improvement across the board. Nothing really new. Little bit of heads up, for the sake of consistency, I'm mainly going to be referring to this unit as Swordsman, even if I'm talking about Elemental Duelist. I just think Swordsman feels more right. But yeah, anyways, Swordsman doesn't really have any glaring weaknesses. His health is actually pretty solid and his damage is quite amazing. Arguably, his only weakness is that the fact that he's a melee unit and that his speed is mediocre, but it's not really that bad of a weakness given that his stats is kind of meant to be a melee unit at the first place anyways, so it's fine. His usages are about as expected. You would use him on mainly short-range red enemies to shred them as quickly as possible. This works on many short-range red enemies like one-horns or boars and even shy boys, as long as you protect Swordsman well. He's also good in shredding down Nyandem and Little Nyandem, as these enemies have very long attack rate between their attacks, and if timed correctly, then Swordsman would be able to mow down these enemies really fast at record speed. Probably the only early game red enemy that he doesn't really work on is JK Bun Bun, as JK Bun Bun just have enough range to be able to outrange Swordsman while also having an extremely high damage. Most melee units would get crushed under the fist of many Bun Bun variants, and that includes Swordsman. But for a majority of the early to mid game red enemies, then yeah, Swordsman performs incredibly well, and for a while is known to be amongst one of the more useful rare cats. But that doesn't really last too long. Eventually, the game starts introducing some more higher ranged red enemies that Swordsman might not really be able to counter. Professor A is a backliner red enemy with constant attack and a pretty good amount of damage output that only proper tankers can hit them, or units with extremely high range. Swordsman is neither of these. He's not a tanker and he can't outrange Professor A. He would always get repelled by Professor A's attacks, and so there's really no way for him to be able to hit Professor A at the first place. Though in fairness, there's really not that much units that can work on Professor A. Other red units also includes Berserkori and Toucan. These are red traded enemies that can do wave attacks. But once again, Swordsman cannot really be properly used on these enemies alone without basically getting blasted to oblivion. He doesn't really have the health to tank out the wave, nor does he have enough speed to be able to be timed between the wave. It's simply not really worth trying to like lure the enemies close to the base just for Swordsman to be able to land one hit or two. But after that, Swordsman would just immediately die. But it's not all too bad because at least he works on Cappy. Cappies are single target red enemy with extremely powerful attack. A single hit from Cappy would kill a majority of cat units. But since he's single target, you're still able to put down a bunch of meat shields to protect your Swordsman from Cappy hitting them. So despite Cappy being able to outrange Swordsman, Swordsman can still deal a great amount of damage towards Cappies as long as you put enough meat shields in front of him. Though for the most part, it's actually usually not that simple. Most Cappy stages has many enemies that backs him up, or enemies that would try to aim to kill your meat shields. More often than not, your Swordsman would probably still die relatively quickly, either because of the support enemies that goes alongside the Cappies, or because the other enemies in the stage would destroy your meat shields, leaving your Swordsman open to be hit by Cappy. There are still many scenarios where Swordsman can still work against Cappy, but a lot of the times he's not exactly amazing against Cappies either. There might be times where he works, but doesn't really work to a point where he just straight up counters Cappies. He kinda just helps sometimes. Some other times he just doesn't work at all. So there comes to a point in the game where Swordsman wasn't really getting that much relevancy. And this was a long time ago too. But there was a point in time where he suddenly gains his relevancy back, thanks to the Deadly Advent stage reverse sticks. Deadly Advent stages are usually regarded as a pretty big deal. So if a unit is able to work on a Deadly Advent stages really well, well, then they would be generally respected by the community. One of those deadly advantaged river sticks features Hanya, the high-range red enemy with powerful attack. Hanya is backed up by occasional Arost and Boars, the latter which Swordsman is very good against. You'd want to kill the Arost and Boars as quickly as possible, so Swordsman would perform pretty well on the stage since he's able to shred down Boars. But more importantly, Swordsman can also work on a particular strategy against Hanya itself. If you use Cat, the super rare that guarantees freeze on red enemies, then it is possible to have a setup to perma-freeze Hanya for a bit at the start of the stage. If you're able to pull that off, then your next goal is to burst Hanya down as quickly as possible before the Arost arrives and kills everything. So you're sort of in like a time limit to kill Hanya as quickly as possible before you're getting pushed back again by the Arost. So for this strategy, you'd want as much damage as possible, and in that case, Swordsmen who have extremely high damage output is extremely vital in this strategy. He's quite a key component in trying to do this rush down cheese strat for Hanya. This strategy was very popular as River Styx was once a very threatening stage. And with how important Swordsman damage is in this strategy, Swordsmen become quite respected once again. After all, there's really not that much other anti-red units in the game that can dish out this high of a damage output as quickly as Swordsman. Swordsman is the way to go if you want to pull this strategy off. But also, unfortunately, this is where Swordsman probably peaked. After Hanya, the game hasn't really had that much common red enemies in a long while. Boars and Shy Boys are basically the only semi-threatening red enemies that Swordsman can work on, and even then, they're not that threatening. The only other enemies that he works on are like peons, like the seals or BB bunnies or whatever. Meanwhile, the enemies that Swordsmen are good against are actually not that much of a problem on their own. At this point in the game, enemies like Boars and Shy Boys can get destroyed by many other units with little problem, either by brute force or simply because of the existence of many other units that can counter these enemies really well. Swordsman's specialty is no longer that unique or valued anymore, especially with how there's just a bunch of existing anti-reds that work as well or sometimes even better than Swordsman. I'm sure many Battle Cats players has one particular unit in mind when I said that, as there exists one particular anti-red unit that is so powerful that they've been used on like basically every red focus stages in the game, and trumps most other anti-reds as well. You already know it. The unit that I'm thinking of is, of course, starts with a C and everybody loves it. It's Crazefish Cat. What? Courier? No, Courier hasn't existed like years later. No, like yeah, even way before Courier's existence, Crazefish and his true form Manic Island Cat is the go-to anti-red for basically everything. Crazefish is also a melee anti-red unit, but unlike Swordsman Cat, Crazefish is a unit that relies on the strong against ability rather than the massive damage ability. Crayfish's overall base stats is way better than Swordsman, especially in the true form. Its health is way higher, its base damage is also way higher. The only main thing that he loses on Swordsman is his slightly longer cooldown, but his base stats is way better than Swordsman. That being said, Swordsman's effective damage against red enemies is still pretty higher than Crazefish Cat or Manic Island, so if you want to burst down red enemies, then surely Swordsman Cat is still a better pick, right? And technically speaking, in a sense, yeah, but it's really not that straightforward. There's still many things to consider, like what about other enemies in the stage? What if there's other traits in the stage than just red enemies? Swordsman may be good for specific red enemies, but what if you want a unit that is more versatile in the stage than just trying to counter one particular enemy in the stage? Then in that case, Crayfish's high general stat would be overall much more valuable to bring. Not to mention, Crayfish in general is way more independent than Swordsman. Basically, Swordsman is a unit that heavily relies on other units' support to actually work. For example, even on enemies like Boars, Swordsman generally still relies on other units to stop Boars' advances first to work, whether that's using proper meat shieldings or red tankers like Sushi, or using powerful anti-red debuffers like the aforementioned Cat, etc, etc. Boar normally by himself pushes rather hard, so freezing him would be ideal for Swordsman to work. Even if Swordsman outranges Boar, you still need to make sure that the Boar doesn't actually touch Swordsman. He heavily relies on other unit support to actually work. Meanwhile, units like Crazefish is actually able to deal with Boar with minimum support, or at the very least, he doesn't really depend on it to actually work, since Crazefish have very high amount of health that he can actually tank a good amount of hits from Boars itself. Sure, there may be times where he would like some supports, whether it's by weakening them or by slowing them or whatever, but for the most part, Crazefish is much more independent and less of a hassle to actually use against boars. Besides, if you use something like iCat to permafreeze the boar, then do you really need Swordsman to actually burst down the boar itself? Chances are you can just burst down the boar using anything at the first place. You can also say basically the same thing against some of the waiver red enemies that I've mentioned, Berserkori and Toucan. Swordsman alone isn't going to work against these enemies due to their powerful wave attacks and Swordsman mediocre health. To get him to work, you're gonna need something like Octopus. Octopus Cat, the true form of Sadako Cat, is a wave blocker, meaning that it's able to disable any waves that it comes in contact with. With the help of Octopus, then you're able to use Swordsman together, so you're able to burst down Berserkori and Toucan. That's pretty simple. But there are several things to note here. First of all, Octopus's creation was a bit later compared to other super rares, so there was a time where we had to fight these waivers without Octopus. In these cases, like I've mentioned, Swordsman would basically just be straight up unusable, while Crazefish doesn't really have this problem at all. Crazefish is able to tank these wave attacks no problem. And second of all is that after the creation of Octopus, the majority of these early mid-game wave stages would just get instantly crushed, regardless of whether you bring Swordsman or not. These stages were not balanced with Octopus in mind, so with Octopus existing, just bringing him already essentially breaks the stage. So Swordsman was basically never vital for any of these stages whatsoever. And there's still one more thing, which is that after the creation of Octopus, then the balance of wave stages starts to shift. Now, Pono starts designing wave stages with Octopus in mind. Octopus will still be a key unit in most wave stages, but the waivers would usually be accompanied by some other enemies that can counter melee units in order to combat Octopus. Whether it be because of LD enemies or high range backliner or something to chip down melee units or whatever, but essentially in doing so, these sort of enemy combinations or stage designs are not just going to counter Octopus, but it would counter majority of other short range melee units as well, and that includes Swordsman. You're still gonna use Octopus for a lot of these stages, but are you going to use Swordsman when he's probably going to get juggled by like LD enemies or get shredded by some short range pushers? In those kind of cases, then Swordsman might not be the unit you want to use. Perhaps you want to use someone tankier, like, oh, you know, maybe Crazefish? Hell, even sometimes you might just want to use someone with bigger range, like Luxury Bat Cat. These units are much more independent compared to Swordsman Cat, and they fit in with like the later game meta without as much problems. Swordsman really relies on other units to actually function. A lot of the times it's either going to be way too much of a hassle to actually work, or even if it does work, it probably would not work that well in a lot of modern stages. While we have way more other alternatives that can do his job with much less effort and much less hassle. But yeah, at this point in time, people generally still understand the potential of Swordsman, so he's never really looked at as like a quote-unquote bad unit. Like I've mentioned, his damage output is still one of the highest out of the anti-res that we have, and technically speaking, maybe there are some people that would go through these hassle if they are not strong enough to beat certain stages, maybe on like higher crown difficulty or something. So Swordsman Cat still has some respect on him, and yet it really doesn't feel enough. Over the years, his usage still feels pretty limiting, and it's starting to get more obvious in how he starts to lag behind, especially because how a lot more modern stages starts to implement more complex enemy combinations that makes him harder to use, or because of LD enemies that would interrupt him over and over or whatever. Especially with the era of how much LD enemies starts to show up, tanky units like Manic Island starts to have way better results than something like Swordsman. So Swordsman has been kind of struggling for a little while. He needs something to shake things up, and that is of course what talents are for. Talents is a savior for a lot of quote-unquote bad units, and I've mentioned this before in my Archer Cat video that the zombie target talent that Archer got was one of the biggest saving grace that Archer Cat received, and gave him a purpose to be used for once. Now, Swordsman True Form, Elemental Duelist, finally got his talents at version 8.2. One of his biggest talent is also a new trait targeting, and that is the Angel target. Getting a whole new trait for him to actually counter is a really big deal. Many units get their relevancy from their target talent. This would open up a possibility for many enemies to actually get countered by their ability. So naturally, Swordsman Cat getting the Angel talent allows him to be used in much more situations than before. Right? Surely? Right? But that couldn't be further from the truth. The reality is, Swordsman Angel talent barely gave him any usages whatsoever. Unfortunately, majority of the relevant Angel enemies are just something that Swordsman cannot counter at all. Somehow, even worse than the rest he's already struggling against. Most of the actually threatening short-range Angel enemies enemies like Angelic Gory or Angelic Hippo are quite tanky and can be trouble to your meat shielding. Naturally, you'd want to burst down these enemies as quickly as possible, so you'd think that Swordsman would be good against them, but no, Swordsman doesn't outrange these guys. And a lot of these enemies, especially the Angelic Gory, hits extremely hard. Swordsman cannot deal with these angel peons at all, especially with how powerful some of these angel enemies are in higher magnifications. Even Angelic Hippo that doesn't do that much damage can still often interrupt Swordsman, and Swordsman doesn't really have the health to tank these hits. Meanwhile, a lot of the other relevant angel enemies have way higher range, like Slipnir or Chick-fil-A. Slipnir also attacks extremely fast, and Chick-fil-A also has a pretty decent attack speed with very powerful damage. Swordsman can't really land that much meaningful hits towards them. He couldn't really just walk up and attack Slipnir without just getting interrupted over and over, and Chick-fil-A would basically just one-shot him in a one clean swoop. But sure, maybe he doesn't work on these enemies, but like, okay, well, he was good against the red boars, right? And the red one-horns. Well, the boar has an angel variant, Borophim, who is also a melee tanky pusher. So he's gotta be at least good against Borophim, right? But no, that's also still not true. For one, well, Borophim have the same range as the true form of Swordsman Cat. Swordsman cannot attack Borophim safely whatsoever. Majority of the time, Borophim is going to hit Swordsman first, and Swordsman would just get mowed down. You might say, well, okay, you can probably still at least freeze Borophim, right? But it's not that simple, because two of the most common status effects player use against Borophim is either slow, using Sanzo, or weaken, using Thaumaturge. Since neither of these status effects stops Borophim from attacking completely, Swordsman still won't really work that well against Borophim. He would need the freeze from Duelist Cat, but Juliet's not often really a popular pick against Borophim. Juliet herself isn't terrible, she's actually still pretty good, but Sanzo and Thaumaturge is just much more of a preferred pick due to how reliable they are. Plus, Borophim has a whopping 5 knockback count, so it's pretty easy for Borophim to break out of like a permafreeze or something. Trying to make Swordsman work would just be way too much of a hassle. So for the longest time, the only common angel enemy that Swordsman can actually work on are the angel variant of the basic doges, Gabriels. And that's about it. Imagine getting a whole new trait for you to counter, and yet the only enemy that you can actually work on is the common doge variant. That is an awful track record. It's actually kind of pitiful. It's almost embarrassing. Somehow Swordsman angel talent only makes it much more obvious on how bad Swordsman currently is in terms of usages. But well, okay, maybe it's not the end, right? He's a melee unit. That must mean he's at least good against LD enemies, right? LD enemies has blind spot symptom, which makes units with low range generally better against them. So what about the deadly angel advent boss, Cruel Angel Clionel? Clionel is a long range LD unit with a big blind spot that you usually want to rush down. Swordsman, being a melee unit with extremely big damage, sounds like it would be a perfect fit. So naturally he should be good against Clionel, right? He finally finds his usages here, right? Well, if he works against Clionel, you probably would have seen more videos of people using him on Clionel's stage, but we all know that's not a thing. So what's the deal this time? Unfortunately, Swordsman Cat is too slow. His speed doesn't actually let him get inside Clionel's blind spot safely without some sort of setup or specific combos, and even if you have specific setups and combos, you would still require extremely strict timing to actually get Swordsman Cat inside Clionel's blind spot. And even if you can, you still realistically probably only can get like 1 or 2 Swordsman Cat inside Clionel's blind spot before something breaks. Ultimately, once again, it's just really not worth the hassle. It's not worth the effort at all. Swordsman ends up being nearly unusable on most angel trait enemies. His talents that were supposed to save him ends up just showcasing to the community more and more that he's not valued in modern stages. His suffering doesn't just end there. Not only does he not fit to newer stages, but there's also plenty of newer units that does his job way better with much less hassle. Now this time around, I'm actually talking about Courier Cat, the behemoth egg unit with spammable mid-range LD and massive damage against red enemies. With its area, LD, good range, great speed and everything, he works easily with little support for most red enemies and even non-red enemies in general. Technically, its potential max damage isn't as high as Swordsman, sure, but its ease of use and versatility and stackability and area attack and LD and everything trumps Swordsman by miles. Majority of red enemies enemies get shredded by Courier with minimum effort, making Swordsman just have less and less reason to be used. And even if there are some stages where Courier might not work against, then chances are Manic Island would probably work on those stages, and he would probably perform better than Swordsman. And that's for the red side of things. Aside from Courier, another behemoth egg unit that takes over his usages is Mushroom Cat, the mid-range wave immune unit with massive damage against angels. If you thought it was already over for Swordsman, it gets even worse. Mushroom, being the anti-angel mid-ranger, allows him to be used on a lot of proper angel peons like Gories and Hippos, even working really well on bursting down Borvims without the need to freeze it first. Mushroom already counters the enemies Swordsman cannot, and once again he does it with minimum hassle. It's so over for Swordsman. Well, it's not actually over though. Luckily for Swordsman, there are many new angel enemies that got introduced, and with newer angel enemies, he gets more chance to shine. There are actually a couple of angel enemies that he's not too terrible against, like Mini Angel Cyclone as well as Saint Dober. Mini Angel Cyclone has incredible pushing power but gets interrupted really easily. Something with extremely high damage output like Swordsman is able to deal a good amount of damage towards Mini Angel Cyclone, although chances are it's probably better to just use Mushroom anyways. But I figured I'd at least have to mention it, you know. Now Saint Dober is a powerful Surger with Omni Strike. Normally low rangers like Swordsman wouldn't really work against Saint Dober, but majority of Saint Dober stages allows you to do a setup to lure him away from other enemies, then perma-slow or perma-freeze it so that you can burst it down as quickly as possible. This is actually the go-to strategy on majority of Saint Dober stages, since fighting Saint Dober normally is actually more of a hassle than doing this. So once you perma-slow or perma-freeze Saint Dober, you want to burst it down as quickly as possible. So hey, a unit like Swordsman with his angel talent would be quite relevant for this strategy. Finally, an actual relevant case where you want to burst down an enemy as quickly as possible. Hooray to Swordsman usage. Though, I'm not gonna lie to you, I low-key almost forgot about this interaction in the first place. I mean, I fought many Saint Dobers and yet actually just straight up forgot that Duelist can probably work against him. Majority of the time, I'm just able to brute force Saint Dober with many other melee units, even if they're not anti-angels, like Can or Manic Island or Bahamut or even Royal Guard and Dark Laser. Also, I have a video about Royal Guard if you want to learn more about him. And of course, Mushroom also exists. That's also still a very tough competition.
Hi, Editor Lucas here. It's a bit hard to change script now, so this might be a weird segue, but there's some things I want to add. First up is that I want to mention that while most Saint Dober stages are pretty easy to burst down, it's worth mentioning that Zonel's Revenge stage, with Sympathy, has a Saint Dober rushdown at the end of the stage that's actually kind of tight, and that Duelist would actually probably work well here if you lack the damage output. Second of all, I also gotta mention Jumbo Jones. Jumbo Jones is a high-range angel backliner with very high speed, but since he has a very long attack animation, it's possible to constantly interrupt him with either knockback or very high amount of damage output. This isn't too reliable in the first 3 stages that he appears in, but this works really well on his last stage. It's very easy to just lure him and then burst him down as quickly as possible. Duelist works really well in trying to do this strategy, since with enough damage output you can just interrupt him over and over, but also at the same time the stage isn't really that hard in the first place and he's still replaceable by other rushers or if you just use Mushroom, but I'll cut him some slack. I'll count this as a proper usage for him. I didn't use him on my first clear though on Jumbo Jones, and the reason on why I didn't use him is the same reason on why I don't use him on most Saint Dober stages as well. And the reason is actually very simple. It's probably way simpler than you think. The reason on why I don't use Elemental Duelist in general more is because I just forgot he exists.
Like legit, I just haven't used him in so long that I totally forgot that this is a thing that could have been done. And like since I rarely have that much trouble to burst down Saint Dober, I never really thought about using other units to actually make it work.
Even if he has some decent usages here and there, a lot of the time he's not an important enough or unique enough asset in the team. If he were in the team, he'll be a nice help for sure, but most of the stages that he works on are still generally easy to do even without his help. There's just a lot of rusher or nuker units that is powerful enough to do the job of burst damage, or does something that he already does in a similar manner. And this gets way worse if we're talking about a certain monthly event cat.
I wasn't done talking about angel power creep, because I still need to acknowledge the existence of the true form of delivery cat, Cafeteria Cat. Cafeteria Cat is a melee unit with massive damage against angel, basically matching the description of angel talented swordsman, right? But Cafeteria stats, oh my goodness. With the exception of slight cooldown difference, Cafeteria is quite literally better than swordsman in every way. Better damage per hit, better DPS, better range, better speed, and it even have a 50% chance to curse angel enemies. Sure, you might say, oh, but you know, you can give like stout talent to Swordsman, or like give him dupes so that he can go above level 50 or whatever. But like that will never change the fact that Cafeteria's range and speed will always be superior. Also, he has curse. These are extremely important stats when it comes to a lot of more modern stages meta that have a lot of LD threats or just focus on rushdown. The speed and range matters a lot. Majority of the time, Cafeteria will perform so much better than Swordsman in any angel focus stages. Basically, the only reason why you would not use Cafeteria over Swordsman is if you don't have it at the first place. Cafeteria is a month exclusive unit, so many players might not have it if they haven't played for a full year, or if missing a month while playing or something like that. If you don't own Cafeteria, then but if you do own Cafeteria, then yeah, angel usage on Swordsman basically have like nearly zero reason to be used. Just use Cafeteria Cat. Sure, maybe you can still use him as like an extra attacker against Saint Dober, but there's still so much units that can work on Saint Dober that Swordsman doesn't really have like that important uniqueness on them, you know? Modern Swordsman is just really forgettable. It's sad to say, but Swordsman probably peaked at the rush strat for River Styx, and that's it. That really was basically the last proper time he was used as a unique asset. And nowadays, that job is being overtaken by either Manic Island or Courier Cat. Swordsman Cat or Elemental Duelist in the modern meta just have basically almost no reason to be used at all. He is irrelevant. And yet, despite that, when I ask you guys about your opinion on Swordsman Cat in my community post, a surprising amount of you shows a positive reception towards him. Now, don't get me wrong, most people do view him negatively, but not because they think that Swordsman is bad, rather they think because Swordsman gets outclassed by Courier. Despite the fact that Swordsman hasn't even gotten used way longer before Courier even exists, and the one that truly takes his place was Crazefish Cat, not Courier. There's still a surprising amount of people that shows a positive reception towards him, even though he hasn't really been relevant since so long. It is pretty funny when I'm comparing like the reception that Swordsman Cat got compared to the reception that Archer Cat got, because it's almost the exact opposite of each other. Swordsman that hasn't been relevant in years got more positive reception, while Archer Cat that actually is still relevant even in the endgame, even in ZL, he still has his usages. Somehow people generally don't actually give him that much respect, even though in reality Archer actually has reasons to be used. Archer has value, while in the modern meta Swordsman barely has any. I think that boils down to just pure numbers. I think a lot of people sees like Archer Cat's numbers and is not really impressed by the numbers, while people look at Swordsman Cat's numbers and think, oh, you know, this doesn't look too bad. There's really nothing glaringly bad in Swordsman's stats. And so people just assume, well, I mean, he's not bad. But in reality, whether you have good stats or not doesn't always equate to how much value you have. That's just how it is. But yeah, competition is very tough. But you know what the worst part is? To be completely honest with you, even if something like Courier doesn't exist, even if something like Cafeteria or Mushroom doesn't exist, there's probably a good chance that Swordsman still wouldn't be used in the modern meta. In this day and age, his stats is still just lacking in general. Speed and tankiness is very important when it comes to modern meta stuff, and Swordsman lacks both. He also lacks the range to be able to counter majority of relevant enemies in general. His health isn't particularly good to be able to tank through anything in modern stages, and his speed isn't enough to be able to enter blind spot, and he has no relevant immunities whatsoever. His usages are awfully specific and a big hassle, as he pretty much only works if you specifically perma-freeze your target enemies. Swordsman just couldn't really keep up. He's too much of a hassle to work, and majority of the time, even if he does work, it probably just isn't worth it. It's not just modern power creep, it's also just how most modern stages and enemies are designed. The only thing he mainly counters are really old enemies and really old stages. But in the more modern meta, he can barely work at all, and he gets drowned by other peers that outshines him. It would be nice if Ponos could one day give him something to work with so that he can be relevant again. But honestly, I'm not even sure how I would fix Swordsman Cat. Probably the easy thing that a lot of people would think about is give him new target trait. But I feel like one, it would be a little too much to give him like 3 target traits, and 2, I think it would be hard to make it not overlap with existing melee units. There's already a lot of other melee units that does a similar job with Swordsman, but with a different trait. It would be better if they don't really overlap with each other in terms of usages, you know? Like sure, it's good to give Swordsman Cat extra niche, but preferably not at the cost of already existing units being stale, if that makes sense. So maybe you can just give him like, I don't know, better speed so that he can work better on higher range enemies to be timed or to like enter blind spots. Or maybe you can just, I don't know, increase his raw damage output output by a huge amount. If his raw damage output is so high, then maybe he's a hassle, but at least he's a hassle that's worth using, if that makes sense. Maybe you can just give him Savage Blow or whatever. But I think what could actually maybe work is that, what if he has his own chance to freeze? If he has his own chance to freeze, then maybe he doesn't really need to rely on other units' freeze ability to work, since he can just freeze by himself. Plus his attack rate is pretty good, and his cooldown is also pretty nice. So if you give him, for example, like a, I don't know, 30% chance to freeze for 3 seconds or whatever, then stacking up like 2 or 3 Swordsman Cat would be able to consistently freeze certain melee enemies or even certain LD enemies pretty well. That'll definitely work against something like Saint Dober. Maybe that'll even work on like Lionel or Gokuraku or something. I don't know, but at the very least it would be better than what he is now. I think that would actually be pretty neat. I'm sure there are many other ways to potentially fix this guy, though frankly I'm not even entirely positive that Ponos would really do anything like that to non-uber talented units at this point. I've been hoping for years that Ponos would give like Ultra Form or Ultra Talents to non-uber units, but yeah, they haven't ever done that for like years. That seems very unlikely. I do wish that Ponos would one day revisit a lot of these like dead units and give them better purpose, especially in endgames to like shake things up. Even though currently the game has been pretty unbalanced as is, but you know, sometimes Ponos does crazy things that actually works. It would probably take a miracle for Swordsman to be fixed, or at least given some sort of purpose. He doesn't necessarily need better stats or whatever, he just needs some purpose. He needs a purpose to exist. He needs a purpose to be used. Some enemies or some key stages where he would shine on, you know? But maybe, what if I was mistaken? What if he already has a purpose to be used and I just couldn't see it? That's what happened to his Saint Dober usages, right? He technically works against Saint Dober, I just never thought about it. I mean, if you think about it, right? When some people lost their purpose in life, oftentimes they would like need to work on themselves. But there are also times where they might just need to find like a specific person or like a specific situation for them to actually find their true purpose in life. Maybe they already have that potential in them all these times and they just haven't found it. Who knows? Maybe that's the case for Swordsman. Maybe that's the case for you. If you haven't found a purpose in life, I hope you'll find it too. And I hope you're also actively working towards improving yourself so you may reach your goal. I'm sure you can do it. Anyways, that's Swordsman Cat. The main reason why I wanted to review him at the first place is mainly because of his contrast with Archer Cat, and I just think it's a very interesting like two sides of a story, you know? But yeah, that's all. The usual, like, comment, subscribe, join membership, ding that bell. I have a lot of other videos about Battle Cats and other indie games and whatnot. Check those out if you're interested, and I hope you learn a thing or two. And that's about it. I'll catch you another time. See ya.